pleasure to be here today. So my name is Holly Stover. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UC Berkeley. And this is Brian Yudkin. He also works in the lab. We're working together on this project. So we work with Wendy Silver, and I'm basically going to be talking about the research our lab has done over the past 10 years and then introduce you to the current project. So the title of the presentation is Compost Application on Rangeland, Carbon Sequestration and Ecosystem Co-Benefits. So this all began about 10 years ago, actually coming from ranchers themselves who wanted to make an impact on climate change, who wanted to give back to the environment. And essentially by doing carbon sequestration. So in the second slide in the handout, you'll see a diagram of the global carbon cycle. And the units are in petograms, which is equivalent to 1 gigaton. So it really makes you appreciate how much carbon there is on the planet and how much carbon soils store, which is 3 times the amount in the atmosphere. So the way carbon sequestration works is through a natural process. It's the process of vegetation decomposing and adding that organic matter into the soil, which is a huge reservoir. And so in the next slide, we look at grasslands, which cover a substantial portion of the planet. So they are a huge resource for carbon sequestration, and many of them are impacted by human activities and have become degraded. And they've actually lost a lot of organic matter from human activities. So we can actually reintroduce more organic matter into grasslands. And so when this research began, it was looking at manure management. And so often on rangeland, as many of you know, you will land apply manure, just directly apply it right onto the land. And what these data are showing is that results in a lot of carbon storage. So that's increasing in metric tons. It's pretty much doubling the amount of carbon on the top meter of soil just by applying manure. So that in itself is a great way to add carbon to rangeland. But if we look at the later slides, we'll see that manure management is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions and problem for climate change. So there's different sources of greenhouse gases on this diagram on slide 5. And you can see that manure management significantly contributes to nitrous oxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. But then we learn about this practice of composting. So instead of just directly applying manure, if we actually compost it and mature that organic material, that's going to result in a net lower amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So in our lab previously, modeling work was done that basically showed that manure, if we land apply manure, we're going to result in a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's where we turned towards composting. So you'll see in slide 7, composting has much lower emissions. And so over the past 10 years, in 2008, the first field study took place right here at SFREC, and also in Marin County, there was another field trial site. And we're working with green waste compost, so compost produced from manure and plant residue. And over time, it did not result in excess greenhouse gas emissions relative to the natural soil. And in addition to that, there's many amazing benefits of using compost on rangeland. So I'm going to talk about that next in slide 8. So one of the most important things is that it increases forage production. And not only does it increase forage production right away when you apply it the first year, but that benefit occurs for many years subsequently. So in this graph, you can see the compost was applied in 2008. So for 4 subsequent growing seasons, the compost applied soils had much higher forage production than the controls. So the other thing is that it increases the soil carbon pool. So every year, about 1 ton of carbon was added per hectare for over 3 years in this study. And so that's important because that's going to benefit plant growth a lot and soil health. So the more carbon there is in the soil and organic matter, that increases porosity and the storage of nutrients. So this has many ecosystem benefits. So what our lab did is we do both field work, lab work, and modeling. So they took the field data and actually tried to scale it up to see, well, what happens if we actually apply compost throughout California grasslands? So here you can see that looking at a map of California, if we just took, there's 23 million hectares of grassland in California. If you just took half of that land and you applied compost, that's going to sequester 21 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And then that's being compared to other emissions. So livestock itself produces 12 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And then there's several other energy uses that have considerable greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're able to upscale and conduct compost application on that scale statewide, we can significantly contribute to greenhouse gas reduction in California. So we have a major potential to contribute towards mitigating climate change. The other important thing is that obviously many of you may have heard that there's problems with nitrogen eutrophication and deposition that's reducing diversity in grassland, especially in California. But what we found is that compost, because it's a very natural material, it's organic matter, the nutrients are released in a way that's the plants have adapted to, so it's not like synthetic fertilizer, so it hasn't impacted the plant diversity that we've seen yet. And it hasn't increased invasive species in rangeland from our results so far. But several other colleagues as well as our lab are very closely monitoring this. It certainly does impact how plants, their dynamics and what species grow at certain times, and there's certain plants that really respond strongly to it. But overall, in the net scheme of things, it doesn't influence negatively the diversity at all, or the invasive species. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some current research. What happened was we started compost trial in 2008, and then in 2016, a whole bunch of additional sites from the NRCS were added to a long-term study so that we can monitor the effects of compost throughout California, not just here. So does the effect of compost vary based on climate or ecoregion? So that's currently what research is going on in the lab, to see if the effects vary based on the local conditions. And so what you'll see in the following slides from our data is that the effects are universal. So it didn't matter which specific grassland or local climate conditions, we got the same results in terms of carbon sequestration. The other really helpful research that's been going on is the modeling. So like I mentioned, we collect data from the field, but then we need to understand, well, how is this going to affect rangelands in the long term? So using ecosystem modeling, we take the current field data and we project how carbon will be stored for multiple years in the future. And essentially what was found was that, so each year the soil will gain carbon and it will increase plant productivity. And those effects will occur for about a decade, 10 to 15 years. You'll continue to see that impact based on what we know about ecosystem carbon dynamics in grassland. So the model suggests that when you apply compost, you're going to see the benefits for up to 15 years. And the carbon that's stored will remain for over a century. It will very, very slowly decay. So the other important thing is that the carbon that's being sequestered isn't just from the compost itself, it's from the increase in plant productivity. So the grasses and the plants that are growing in the ecosystem are actually the ones that are contributing the extra carbon, not just the compost itself. The other important thing that we look at are the climate scenarios. So several of the other presenters talked about RCPs, so the relative concentration pathway. So these are the climate scenarios, whether or not we have high emissions or we are able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and how that affects the climate in terms of temperature and precipitation. And so here in slide 16, you can see that on the right is RCP 8.5, so the high emissions, and 4.5 is if we're able to reduce emissions slightly. But what we found is that the effects of compost are resilient to those different climate scenarios. Overall, you'll still see the same effect. Okay, so now I want to introduce you to the current project that we're working on. So right now you're standing on one of our research plots. So this is the Healthy Soil Demonstration Project. So I started this project in the fall with Brian and with Jeremy James and Wendy Silver and several other colleagues. We're working on this together. And what we're doing now is we're trying to find out if the effects are similar depending on the type of compost. So traditionally, we've looked at manure management and the green waste compost, like I said, which is composed of green waste, manure, and plant residue. But the new type of compost we're looking at is food scrap waste, so like basically just from human food debris and leftovers. That was composted, and we're seeing if you can have the same ecosystem benefits so that we can utilize more sources of organic waste and divert them from the landfill. And so for this study, what's really interesting is a project that Brian was involved with is they actually, from time zero when the composts were being produced at the compost management facility, they were monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions and the dynamics out there in the facility before they came on land. So the project that Brian was involved with was actually monitoring that closely, so you can see in the figure here. And so these compost piles were turned over and matured over about 2 to 3 months before they were land applied here in the field. So in our next slide, we're just looking at the experimental design. It's a randomized complete block design. And so right now we're in one block. Each of the plots are about 0.4 acres. And this is a green waste compost plot, so you can actually look down and see it on the soil underneath the grass. And it was applied at a 1/4 inch depth. And so that's equivalent to about 33 cubic yards per acre of compost. And so we monitor many things. We're sampling the soil, looking at the nutrients, we're looking at the forage production, and we continually monitor soil moisture and temperature, like Ashley's project that she spoke about earlier. So we can get a chance to walk around and take a look at the plots and some of the sensors. But each plot has moisture sensors and temperature sensors. And Ashley spoke a bit about this earlier, that from previous research we found that composted soils have a greater water holding capacity. So they tend to have greater moisture over the growing season for plants. And the data that I'm showing here are very preliminary, and they're from the winter time. So these are data from our moisture sensors. And essentially when you see between 20 or over 30% moisture, that's a saturated soil. So this is during a really wet time of year. But overall at this stage, I haven't seen a huge difference yet, but I think what happens is the compost is sitting on top of the soil, and over time it gets further incorporated. So we might see a bit more of a distinction later on. So that's kind of what we've seen so far in terms of soil moisture. But I think the main point is just to drive home that essentially when we're applying compost, we're not only doing something to mitigate climate change, but there's many ecosystem co-benefits. We see an increase in forage production, soil fertility, water holding capacity, and sustainability of the soil. And then the other important thing is that these benefits aren't just temporarily for a year. They can occur, as projected by the modeling, for multiple years into the future. So even though it may be expensive and difficult to do the compost application, it's a very thin layer of compost that you need. And it can be done and then not have to be redone again for another 15 or 20 years, or even ever again, and you can sequentially work over all of the rangeland that you have. So that's essentially what I want to share with you guys today. So please feel free to go ahead with any questions, and we can walk around and look at the site as well.
So have you done this for enough years that you're confident that this effect will last for 10 or 15 years?
So what I forgot to mention is, so the study began in 2008, and so now it's been resampled last summer. So what we're actually going to see really from our real field data, what's happened after 10 years. But with the modeling, these are actually proven really well-tested models for California grassland. So we can say pretty confidently that it's likely to happen. Yeah. Sorry, this fellow just put his hand up first, and then we'll go to you.
How many tons per acre did you put on, and what did it cost you on an applicated acre?
So I usually just can I do volumes, if that's okay? Okay, yeah, so basically it's 33 cubic yards per acre. And that looks like essentially like a 1/4 inch depth. And previously they had done 1/2 inch, but they realized that was more than what was necessary. So we actually did less.
And you didn't incorporate it into the ground?
Nope, you just
surface.
Yeah, you just land apply it right on. And it settles down itself. That's why we do it in the fall. So we do it before the rains, and then with the rains it just kind of nicely settles into the soil.
What did it cost?
So it can be expensive. To get it, because we were transporting it pretty far, because it was a special research study we did with the food waste compost, it was about $800 for the trucking. Our compost, because it's for research, was donated, but it's usually for 1 acre, it would be about $900 for the compost.
for the
Yeah.
for just the compost, or
Yeah.
the compost and the trucking and the application?
Let me get back to. I think it might be for both. Yeah, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe Jeremy. Yeah, we'll get back to you, but I think.
Yeah, I
It,
want to say it was more like 20 to 40 bucks a yard.
yeah, so it's probably including trucking for that.
Is that including the truck?
No,
That's just for the compost
material.
plus trucking and
Yeah.
application.
Yeah, and like Ashley was talking about earlier, the main hope with this line of work is that we can stimulate more access to compost facilities locally, or even on ranch type of composting down the road. Because obviously your trucking is gonna be uneconomical in a lot of situations, and also in your life cycle analysis. Did you talk about that a little bit on the life cycle stuff?
Yeah, I think it's kind of when you look at it in the long term, I think it pans out, especially the benefit because it saves a lot of money that you won't need for extra feedstock, or because you're getting more forage production. So there's certain like economic benefits to using it. I'm sorry, you can go ahead.
You mentioned that you're looking at nutrients and levels. What specifically are you looking at?
So we mainly, I guess one other thing that reminds me of is to mention is that, so if you're using a certified compost facility, there'll be detailed analyses done on the compost so you can see the amounts of micronutrients. Always you want like nitrates, ammonia, all of your nitrogen content, carbon content, organic matter, pH. So those are kind of the key things. Once it gets land applied, we focus on looking at nitrogen because it is one of the most important nutrients for plants. So when we take soil samples, we're measuring the amount of available nitrogen. We also look at the pH and how that changes because it affects nutrient availability, the moisture, and the total carbon and nitrogen content. And when we sample forage, we also look at the nutrient value of the forage. And previously, it showed that compost increased the amount of nitrogen and carbon in the grass, so it actually increased the nutritional value of the forage.
Thank you.
Are you looking at the differences in soil types and how applying the compost on different soil textures and soil types with different starting materials and nutrients has an impact on that long-term effect?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's what's happening in the current study that I mentioned, where they added 6 additional sites. They're in very different areas with very different soil types. And I think the trend is kind of intuitive that if you have a richer soil or in a more productive system, you'll see increased benefits. But that being said, you still see the same universal effect regardless.
What are we talking quantity-wise in terms of increased forage production?
So I think that's why the graphs are really helpful. It's almost double, I believe.
So it would go from producing 2,500 pounds per the acre to 5,000 pounds per the acre? Is that what the graph is telling us?
Let's just check. Yeah, it was roughly double relative to the control, and it depends on the year too. But yeah, I'd say about 1/3.
My grams per liter is not very efficient at converting.
Yeah, I think if you just apply like about 2 times or like
Okay.
1/3 more. Yeah. That's at least initially for the first few years. The amount of forage increase would slowly like decrease over time, so there wouldn't be a difference.
Do you graze any of the test sites?
Yeah, so we did do grazing. We basically want to emulate the natural conditions of how a rancher would use this land. So before we started the study in the fall, it was grazed. And then during the spring, we had stockers on here for about a week. There were 79 steer. And then again in the fall, we'll graze again. Yeah.
900 bucks an acre is a lot of money. I don't think there's enough compost around to physically apply that much to the ground. And I've done some soil tests. I priced out straightening out the fertility, the pH, pK, in micros. For me, it's at that 150 an acre value, which is still high, but would we see similar effects of increasing, feed production, increasing organic matter through the use of judicious use of commercial fertilizer over as opposed to compost?
It's a good question. I mean, you're going to see an increase in growth with the synthetic fertilizer, that's for sure.
Can you just speak up, please?
Oh, sorry. I'm just thinking about it. Yeah, I think the difference is just that with compost, it's like you have this matrix of organic matter, and if you can't really replace that with synthetic fertilizer. It's really replenishing something really important in the soil. That it's kind of like this matrix that provides exchange sites that's going to trap ions, that's going to hold onto nutrients and water, and provide that medium to really sort of catalyze the reactions in the soil that increase growth and things like that. So, and it's more long lasting too. Like if you apply fertilizer, it's going to leach out. So I think it's going to increase forage and provide that effect to a certain extent, but in no way to the same magnitude. I think compost would.
If you put cows on it, and they do their own composting.
That's true. That also helps. But yeah, I understand what you mean. That right now we're currently facing those kind of barriers to getting it more widely adopted.
Do you guys
before and after cation exchange capacity test?
Not in this specific study, but that would be really interesting though.
I think it's pretty well proven that compost is just all around the better solution. It's just a matter of getting that going. Did you guys ever work with Elaine Ingham? Or heard of Elaine Ingham? She does, I don't know how it's funded, but she, I think, is in Northern California, and she does really wide-scale restoration projects with getting the soil a certain way, like for whatever you're growing, to be able to sustain it over the long term, like indefinitely, with just that initial application.
Okay.
But she's
Yeah,
Elaine
I haven't heard
Ingham.
of that name, but I'd love to look it up later and get that from you.
It seems like you just have to, if you're going to do this composting, you just have to build it into your budget every year and do a little section or something of your property, and just start making the change, because it seems like because of the climate issues, we're going to be forced to change in some ways, and so that's how I'm looking at it.
Yeah.
Is that there's always can we afford it or can we not afford it, and sometimes you have to go, okay, well, we cannot afford not to do something different, so
Yeah.
so we try at certain places, then maybe slowly but surely.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So as you continue to research this, you might want to develop data that would convince legislators and people in charge in government that this is so good for society that they can afford to
Yeah.
subsidize it, because I can't see where it would ever be economical for a landowner to apply this unless they got some.
I think
There are some grants available through, I forget exactly who it is, but I have a business card in my car and talking to people. There are some grants available right now to start doing this. I don't know what.
CDFA,
the
Healthy Soil
CDFA,
Program.
thank you.
There's funding opportunities with that program. But the difference is that the requirement within the program is that you repeat the application in a multiple year scenario versus the general recommendation that's been through Wendy Silver is that the Marine Carbon Project is that it's the one application of the quarter in. But the program, CDFA, requires that you do it in a multiple year. So, and that's, I'm not sure, do you know, have any idea of why that requirement is?
I I do not.
I know Wendy is not happy about that stipulation, and she's working hard to kind of alter it because the single application kind of has these decade-long benefits.